Stupidity, in its most terrifying form, is not a lack of intelligence. It is a refusal to see, to reflect, to feel the weight of what something truly means. Marie-Louise von Franz, who walked the inner terrain of dreams and myth with fearless precision, never spoke of stupidity lightly. For her, it was not a joke, nor a harmless condition. It was a profound failure of consciousness, the soul's decision to remain asleep even when the alarm has long been ringing. It is not that the stupid cannot think. It is that they will not think beyond the surface, beyond the expected, beyond the self. We are used to picturing stupidity as something simple, the inability to learn, to solve, to reason, but von Franz saw something far more dangerous hiding under that definition. True stupidity is subtle. It dresses itself in certainty. It thrives in systems, in slogans, in half-truths repeated until they sound like prophecy. It avoids complexity because complexity demands humility, and the truly stupid mind cannot bow. It is too frightened to question and too proud to admit it. This is why stupidity cannot be fixed with more information. It is not an intellectual problem, it's a symbolic one. The stupid person, as von Franz understood it, is cut off from symbolic life. They do not see metaphors. They do not hear irony. They do not suspect their own motives. They live only in the literal, the functional, the flat. To them, a tree is just wood, a stranger is just a label, and a story is just entertainment. But in losing the symbolic, they also lose the soul, and what remains is not neutral. It is hungry. It becomes an emptiness that devours meaning wherever it finds it. Jung believed that the unconscious would speak whether we listened or not, but when it is ignored long enough, it does not go quiet, it goes blind. It calcifies, it turns into a kind of end-knowing. Von Franz saw this in people who clung to roles, rules, and rigid moralism while never looking inward. Their lives were outwardly respectable but inwardly hollow. The truly terrifying part of this kind of stupidity is that it often looks responsible, educated, even successful, but it is divorced from imagination, from conscience, from the soul's inner dialogue. Stupidity, then, is not the opposite of brilliance. It is the opposite of awareness. It is the mind without mirror, the heart without depth, and it is not rare. In fact, it is everywhere. We are afraid to look too closely. Von Franz did not write about this to condemn. She wrote to awaken, to remind us that every time we choose convenience over truth, every stupidity, in its darkest form, is not accidental. It is chosen by the psyche, chosen in secret, behind the mask of certainty, beneath the polished language of reason. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this not as a flaw in intelligence, but as a failure in moral imagination. When the mind refuses to confront its own contradictions, its own unresolved fears, it splits. One part thinks, calculates, performs, the other hides in shadow. And when the light of awareness no longer reaches that hidden place, something begins to fester. This is where stupidity is born, not as ignorance, but as betrayal of the self. The personal shadow, as Jung defined it, is made of all the parts we reject or repress. Impulses, fears, memories, truths we do not wish to know. But von Franz took this further. She saw how the shadow doesn't just sit quietly in the corner of the psyche, it acts. It thinks. It mimics the ego and corrupts its clarity. It pretends to be rational. It speaks in slogans and familiar ideas, offering quick answers to questions that require the discomfort of reflection. This is shadow thinking, the intelligence of the unconscious turned inward against growth, against depth, against truth. People caught in shadow thinking are not unintelligent. That is what makes it so dangerous. Often, they are sharp, articulate, even convincing, but their thinking has a blind spot, a place they refuse to touch, and so their knowledge becomes distorted. It avoids complexity. It collapses opposites. It reduces living truths into dead categories, good or bad, smart or stupid, right or wrong. Anything that threatens their inner image of control is labeled foolish, dangerous, unworthy. This is not thought, it is defense. And in the name of order, it commits quiet violence against reality. Von Franz saw how the shadow loves to hide behind certainty. It weaponizes conviction. It clings to rigid belief systems, not out of strength, but because it cannot face doubt. Doubt would mean turning inward. Doubt would mean facing the parts of oneself that are not noble, not heroic, not perfect. And so the shadow thinks for us sufficiently, defensively, destructively. In moments of true awareness, the ego does not dominate the shadow. It listens to it. It risks being changed by it. But shadow thinking cannot allow this. It cuts off dialogue. It replaces curiosity with slogans, empathy with correct. There is a moment when the individual disappears, not by death, but by merger into the crowd, the cause, the flag. It feels like belonging. It feels like truth, but it is something else. Carl Jung called it archetypal possession, a psychic event in which a person becomes seized by a force greater than themselves, often without knowing it. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this phenomenon not as rare, but as terrifyingly common. When a group moves as one, not by shared reflection but by shared emotion, it is not consciousness that speaks, it is the unconscious unleashed. And the result is what she feared most: collective stupidity. Collective stupidity is not the absence of thought, it is the death of independent thought under the weight of mass certainty. It happens quietly, seductively. A story begins to repeat. A symbol is exalted. An enemy is named. Doubt is shamed. Nuance dissolves. And soon, the group knows everything it needs to know. Not from inquiry, but from inheritance. It speaks not with its own voice, but with the voice of myth. The dangerous kind. The kind that forgets it is a metaphor. Von Franz saw how myths can liberate the soul when they are lived symbolically. But when they are mistaken for literal truth, they possess. They infect nations. They stain ideologies. They turn communities into mobs. Not all stupidity is collective, but all collective stupidity shares one trait: it feels righteous. It is the energy of the crusade, the revolution that eats itself. The laughter that turns to cruelty because no one wants to be the first to stop cheering. Group identity feeds on simplicity. It must. Complexity is dangerous to the crowd. It slows the rhythm. It breaks the chant. And so anything uncertain, whether a person, an idea, or a history, is exiled. The group thrives not because it seeks truth, but because it eliminates friction. And without friction, there is no thought, only heat, only motion, only destruction. What makes this stupidity so devastating is that it is nearly invisible from the inside. The possessed person believes they are awake. The mob believes it is just. The slogans sound like wisdom because they are old, because they echo the stories we've told for centuries, of heroes and enemies, of chosen people and cleansing fires. But the soul, von Franz would say, cannot survive on echo. It requires silence. It requires the courage to step back from the group and ask, is this truly mine? The individual must awaken within the collective, or the collective will devour them. That is the task, not to abandon others, but to remain conscious in their presence. Von Franz knew that the most dangerous. The fool wears many faces. He appears in myths as the jester, the clown, the wanderer who speaks nonsense, and somehow reveals the deepest truth. He dances at the edge of the fire, laughing when others are silent, mocking when others kneel. But there is a difference, one Marie-Louise von Franz understood with piercing clarity, between the holy fool and the truly unconscious one. Both are irrational. Both may break the rules. But one carries the light of awareness in his mischief, while the other is simply blind. The trickster archetype is not evil, but it is dangerous. It is the energy in the psyche that defies order, that destabilizes structures too rigid to breathe. Jung described it as a primordial figure, half animal, half god, who disrupts, deceives, and exposes. The trickster enters where control has grown stale and shatters the illusion of stability. He is sacred because he brings renewal, but only when he is met with consciousness. Without it, the trickster collapses into chaos, and chaos without insight becomes stupidity. Von Franz knew that many confused the fool's laughter with foolishness. But real foolishness, the unconscious kind, is not humorous at all. It is repetitive, self-centered, and sealed off from its own impact. The holy fool disrupts to reveal truth. The unconscious fool disrupts because he cannot see beyond his own noise. One is held lightly by irony, the other is shackled by ego. And the more he resists his own ignorance, the more violently he insists he is right. There is a sacred kind of laughter, the kind that rises not from cruelty, but from recognition. The fool who embodies this is not trying to be clever. He simply reflects the absurdity of what we pretend not to see. He mirrors the king's pride, the scholar's vanity, the priest's hidden doubt. He humbles the world through humor. But the shadow of the trickster wears the same smile. Only this one mocks what it does not understand. It tears down for the thrill of destruction. It plays dumb, not as wisdom, but as escape. In our time, the trickster walks in many disguises. The influencer, who ridicules truth, the politician who jokes away responsibility, the skeptic who confuses cynicism for intelligence. These are not fools in the sacred sense. They are figures of unconscious mischief, spreading disruption without the anchor of soul. Von Franz would say they are possessed by the archetype, not living it, but being lived by it. And when a culture elevates these figures, when laughter becomes a shield against reflection, stupidity grows disguised as charm. But the true fool, the one who serves something deeper, remains rare. He is not the loudest. He is the one who dares to speak the absurd truth that makes us pause. There is a kind of stupidity that hides behind brilliance. It speaks with elegance, argues with precision, and dazzles with facts. It wins debates, writes books, leads institutions. And yet, when the moment calls for depth for soul, it vanishes. Marie-Louise von Franz saw this often. Intelligence, she wrote, is no guarantee of wisdom. In fact, it can become a mask so polished that even the wearer forgets what lies beneath. The more clever the mind, the more intricate its defenses against feeling, against mystery, against the humbling work of becoming fully human. Wisdom is not a function of IQ. It is not the accumulation of knowledge, nor the ability to impress. Wisdom begins where certainty ends. It begins when the ego, no matter how sophisticated, learns to bow to the unknown, to the irrational, to the symbolic voice that speaks not in data, but in dreams. Jung made this distinction clear. The intellect serves the ego, but wisdom serves the self, and the self cannot be mastered, it can only be listened to. The danger lies in mistaking insight for transformation. A person may understand every psychological term, quote Jung flawlessly, and yet remain completely unconscious of their own shadow. Cleverness can narrate the journey without ever taking a step. It can explain away suffering, rationalize cruelty, and turn the soul's cry into a case study. Von Franz watched how some of the most learned people failed utterly at relationships, at humility, at listening to the quiet voice within. Their intelligence became a fortress, and within it, they withered. What makes this kind of stupidity so insidious is that it looks like success. It is praised, rewarded, followed, but it does not nourish, it consumes. It leaves a wake of shallow certainty and emotional hollowness. This is the intellect unmoored from the heart. This is the mind that builds complex systems to avoid simple truths. The truth, for example, that no one is above the work of self-confrontation, that no theory can replace the difficult grace of becoming vulnerable, or forgiving, or silent when silence is needed. Wisdom moves differently. It is slow where intelligence is fast. It asks rather than answers. It waits, and when it speaks, it carries the weight of having suffered, of having changed. Von Franz knew this in her bones. She saw how dreams often came to humble the brilliant, to bring images that no textbook could decode, to ask, again and again, will you feel this, or will you just name it? In the end, intelligence may impress, but it cannot transform. Only wisdom can do that, and wisdom grows not in the mind, but in the space between knowing and not knowing. In that space, when language dies, meaning follows, not with silence, but with noiseless repetition, slogans emptied of soul, words that once pointed to mystery now used to control or distract. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this as the wounding of the logos, the principle of meaning itself. In Jungian psychology, logos is not just speech, it is the bridge between consciousness and the unknown. It is how we shape thought, how we express the inner world. When that bridge collapses, stupidity does not rush in, it creeps, quietly, through the cracks in our vocabulary. True stupidity rarely sounds stupid. It sounds certain, it sounds smooth. It knows all the right phrases, but none of the weight behind them. Von Franz saw how it becomes a mask for unconsciousness. A person speaks, but the words do not come from experience. They come from the collective, from the headlines, from someone else's mind. It is what it is. Everything happens for a reason. These are not truths. They are placeholders. They stop reflection before it begins. Wounded language is not just hollow, it is manipulative. In the hands of the unconscious, words become weapons. Propaganda emerges not only in politics, but in relationships, in families, in the subtle ways people use language to defend against truth. Words that once held symbolic power, freedom, love, healing, become distorted. They are used to sell, to seduce, to suppress. And the more we hear them misused, the more we forget what they meant in the first place. Symbolic life begins to wither in this climate, where once a word was an invitation to reflect, to wonder, to feel it, becomes a command. Think this, want this, hate this. Stupidity flourishes, not by silencing us, but by flooding us with noise. And when the logos is no longer rooted in soul, the mind becomes a parrot. It speaks, but it does not know what it says. Von Franz believed that symbolic thinking is essential to psychological health. To hear the image behind the word, to speak not from habit, but from the depth of lived experience. This kind of language cannot be mass-produced. It breaks easily under pressure, but it heals, it connects, it allows room for silence, for contradiction, for reverence. And that is precisely what stupidity cannot tolerate. The erosion of meaningful language is not a side effect, it is a symptom. It tells us we are drifting from the symbolic world, from the inwardness that gives words their soul. When language is wounded, so is consciousness. And the repair begins, not with louder voices, but with quieter ones. With people willing to pause before they speak, to listen for the echo inside a word, to ask what it truly means not to others, but to them. That is how the logos heals. Not in mass messages, but in small acts of conscious speech. In words that remember they were once alive. There is a chill that runs deeper than cruelty. It is the quiet, bureaucratic voice, the soft nod, the signature on the paper that ruins a life. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, the terrifying truth that the greatest horrors are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who think and who obey without question, who never once pause to reflect. Marie-Louise von Franz would have recognized this not just as evil, but as a failure of imagination, a collapse of inner life, the moment where stupidity and evil meet not as twins, but as collaborators. Stupidity is not the source of evil, but it is its most reliable ally. It softens the ground, it silences the conscience, it replaces thought with obedience, image with dogma. Von Franz understood evil not merely as the presence of malice, but the absence of reflection. Evil becomes possible when people stop asking real questions, when they turn inward just far enough to justify, never far enough to doubt. That is the core of the problem. Evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and stupidity hands it the mask. The most frightening acts in history were not committed in states of rage, but in states of routine. Systems were built, papers were filed, orders were followed. Arendt was right to call this banality, but von Franz would add that such banality is never neutral. It is what happens when the symbolic life dies, when language loses meaning, when symbols are hollowed out and turned into propaganda, when ritual becomes habit rather than soul. In this emptiness, evil becomes efficient, and stupidity keeps it moving. The stupid person is not always cruel, but they are dangerous because they cannot or will not see the impact of what they do. They follow rules without questioning the system that made them. They believe what is convenient, not what is true. They dismiss complexity. They shrink their moral world to the size of personal comfort. And when such people gather in large numbers, or fall under the spell of ideology, the result is not simply ignorance, it is complicity. Von Franz warned that evil often enters through the back door of the sector, door left open by unexamined fears, by collective shadow, by the seductive lure of certainty. Evil thrives where the symbolic mind has gone quiet. It does not need hatred, it only needs people who no longer dream. People who speak without reflection, act without doubt, and move through the world convinced of their own goodness, because they have never dared to see otherwise. Stupidity may not intend harm, but that is exactly what makes it so potent. It cannot recognize itself, and in that blindness, it becomes a vessel for forces darker than it can comprehend. Evil is rarely loud. It often arrives gently, smiling, perfectly reasonable, and stupidity, like a faithful servant, opens the door. There is a kind of stupidity that does not shout, but sighs. It sits quietly at the dinner table, nods absently in bed, smiles through clenched teeth. It isn't violent or dramatic. It is numb. It is the dull ache of two people who no longer speak soul to soul. Marie-Louise von Franz knew that the greatest failures of relationship often have nothing to do with intelligence or even intention. They begin when the inner dialogue dies, when two psyches stop growing in the presence of each other, and instead repeat, react, retreat. This is not misunderstanding. It is unconsciousness in disguise. To truly relate to another person is not a matter of knowing facts or saying the right words. It is the willingness to remain open to their mystery, to not reduce them to a role, a story, a past mistake. But when the psyche grows lazy, when we no longer reflect on ourselves or the other, something slips. We stop asking, what is this really about? And instead assume, judge, defend. Projection begins to replace perception. We do not see the person, we see our wound, our fear, our unmet need reflected in their eyes, and we believe it. Von Franz understood that most people never truly relate. They relate to the image they've created in their minds and call it love. They fall in love with a projection and then feel betrayed when the projection cracks. The other becomes selfish, too much, not who I thought, but what really died was not the other, it was the fantasy. And instead of mourning the fantasy and learning to see, we blame, we withdraw, we harden. Stupidity in relationships often appears as emotional laziness, the refusal to engage in the work of inner questioning. It is easier to say you always than to ask, why do I react this way? It is easier to say you don't, you understand me, than to wonder, have I truly tried to understand you? This is the death of inner dialogue. When ego replaces curiosity, when reaction replaces reflection, when silence grows not because of peace, but because there is nothing left to say that hasn't already been said 100 times. But relationships are not built on repetition. They are built on presence, on seeing each other again and again with fresh eyes. Jung said that every relationship is a crucible for individuation, a place where the self can either be mirrored into greater wholeness or distorted into shadow. Von Franz would add that stupidity arises when we choose the latter path, not by malice, but by habit. The antidote is not cleverness, it is humility. It is the courage to admit that we do not fully know ourselves or the other, and to begin again not with answers, but with attention. That is how dialogue is reborn, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, sacred act of listening before we speak. There is a kind of knowing that does not arrive through argument. It does not shout, does not prove itself in bullet points or policy. It dreams, senses, waits. Marie-Louise von Franz recognized this as the feminine mode of consciousness, and intuitive, symbolic, relational intelligence that listens to the soul rather than conquering it. And in our modern culture, this form of wisdom is not only neglected, it is actively drowned by what she called the stupid will, the hardened, linear force of an ego determined to dominate, even when it does not understand. This is not about gender. The feminine, in Jungian terms, is a psychic function present in all of us that perceives meaning through feeling, symbol, and nuance. It moves in circles, not straight lines. It tolerates paradox. It trusts the whisper behind the facts. But this mode of knowing often threatens the ego, particularly when that ego has become over-identified with control, logic, and certainty. The stupid will is what takes over when the ego closes its ears to the unconscious, when it fears the unknown so deeply that it tries to legislate it out of existence. The tragedy is that intuition is rarely dramatic. It offers its warnings softly, in the quiet discomfort before a bad decision, in the sense that something is off long before evidence confirms it. But the stupid will barrels forward anyway. It builds systems that flatten nuance. It calls dreams irrelevant, feelings irrational, and symbols superstitious. And in doing so, it silences the very intelligence that might have saved it from collapse. Von Franz saw this most painfully in the lives of women who had been trained to distrust their own instincts, women whose inner knowing was invalidated by institutions, relationships, and ideologies that insisted on logic without soul. But she also saw it in men who had buried their anima, their own inner feminine, and who could no longer hear the voice of the deeper psyche, calling them back into wholeness. What is most dangerous about the stupid will is its insistence. It does not listen. It pushes harder the more it is resisted. It mistakes force for clarity. And in doing so, it becomes not just stupid but cruel. It ignores the gentle redirections of the unconscious, and calls its destruction progress. It mocks mystery, until mystery becomes monstrous and unmanageable. But the feminine wisdom, even when buried, never disappears. It returns in dreams, in symptoms, in synchronicities that defy explanation. It waits for us in the quiet spaces we've learned to ignore. Von Franz believed that recovering this wisdom is not a luxury. It is a necessity, for without it, we become clever fools in a world we no longer understand, mistaking the sound of our own shouting for the voice of truth. There is a figure that haunts the corners of our psyche, one we often refuse to name. It appears in dreams with a twisted grin, saying nonsensical things with perfect confidence. It stumbles through sacred places, blurts out half-truths, makes decisions with blind certainty. This is the stupid self, not the one we show the world, but the one buried in the unconscious, hidden even from our own gaze. And yet, it is through this figure that the soul begins to speak. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this with a clarity that was both sobering and liberating. We cannot grow until we see the fool within. Dreams are not polite. They do not flatter the ego. They show us, again and again, what we refuse to acknowledge in waking life. In symbolic language, they expose our compulsions, our evasions, our refusal to think or feel deeply. The stupid self might arrive as a clownish stranger, a loud voice at a dinner table, a grotesque version of oneself acting out all the things we work so hard to hide. And yet, it is not there to mock us. It is there to be seen, to be integrated, to be taken seriously as a part of the total psyche. Von Franz saw this inner fool as a form of psychic resistance, the parts of ourselves that drag their feet when change is demanded, that cling to the illusion of simplicity in the face of mystery. This is not the divine fool of myth, who carries sacred wisdom under his rags. This is the unconscious fool, the shadowy figure whose stupidity is a symptom of disconnection, from feeling, from context, from meaning. To meet this figure in dream or active imagination is not to be humiliated, but to be humbled. It is the beginning of self-knowledge, and often, of compassion. The great danger is not in being foolish, but in pretending that we are not, in ignoring the images the unconscious sends us, in rationalizing away the warnings until they grow louder, more destructive, impossible to deny. Those who cannot laugh at their own dreamful risk becoming him, in waking life, rigid, reactive, incapable of reflection. But those who accept the encounter, who sit with the discomfort of seeing themselves through the psyche's unfiltered mirror, begin to change in subtle but irreversible ways. The inner fool, when faced honestly, becomes a guide. He shows us where we are unripe, where we perform certainty instead of embodying truth. Von Franz believed that these dream figures carry soul truths that the conscious mind has disowned. To listen to them, to dialogue with them through active imagination, is to re-enter the living stream of the psyche. Only by dreaming the stupid self can we begin to wake up. The unconscious does not vanish just because we ignore it. It waits, patient and unresolved, shaping our choices from the shadows. Marie-Louise von Franz never saw stupidity as a fixed trait. To her, it was a symptom of unexamined life, of the refusal to listen to what the psyche is always trying to say. And so the antidote is not intelligence, not more information, but inner work, the slow, sacred labor of becoming conscious of what lies beneath the surface of our personality. Most people drift through life governed by inner forces they cannot name. Patterns repeat, reactions flare. Decisions are made not from depth but from habit. Inner work begins the moment we admit this. It begins when we stop treating consciousness like a possession and begin to treat it like a process. Von Franz insisted that we cannot become whole without confronting our inner stupidity, the parts of us that are lazy, reactive, false, and this confrontation cannot happen on the surface. It requires descent. Symbolic living is the key, not abstract belief, but a way of seeing, of understanding that every event, every emotion, carries meaning beyond its face value. The unconscious speaks in images, through dreams, symptoms, slips of the tongue, strange coincidences. When we pay attention to these signs, we begin to see where the ego is blind. We begin to engage with life as a conversation rather than a performance. This is what Jung called individuation, the unfolding of the self, not through mastery, but through relationship between ego and shadow, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine. Von Franz warned that those who do not do this work remain fragmented. They grow older but not wiser. They accumulate knowledge but not depth. Their stupidity becomes entrenched, clever, articulate, defended. But those who turn inward, who ask the hard questions, what do I fear? What do I avoid? What am I pretending not to see? Begin to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but authentically. They become capable of paradox, of silence, of truth. Inner work does not make us perfect. It makes us honest. It allows us to recognize our limits without being ruled by them. It teaches us to laugh at our foolishness without becoming it. And most of all, it brings humility, the kind that opens the door to real wisdom. Because when we see how much of us is unconscious, we stop pretending to know everything. And in that space of not knowing, the self can speak. Stupidity cannot survive long in the presence of the symbolic. It thrives in avoidance, in speed, in distraction. But when we slow down, turn inward, and listen not just to our thoughts, but to our dreams, our discomfort, our intuition, we begin to dismantle it, not by force, but by light. Inner work is not the cure, it is the path. And the walk itself. To live with eyes open is not a metaphor. It is a demand, a quiet, unrelenting one. Marie-Louise von Franz knew that consciousness was not simply a gift, it was a burden, a discipline, and most importantly, a moral act. Because to become conscious is to feel everything, not only the beauty of the world, but its horror, not only our noblest qualities, but the places where we are cowardly, cruel, or numb. Stupidity, in her view, was not just intellectual failure. It was psychic refusal, a turning away from what the soul insists we must see. The truly frightening thing about stupidity is that it feels safe. It wears the mask of certainty, of social consensus, of unexamined tradition. It thrives in speed, in noise, in the flat language of slogans and superficial truths. And it infects not only individuals, but systems, politics, religion, education, anything built without attention to the symbolic dimension of life. For von Franz, stupidity was dangerous, not because it was loud or vulgar, but because it could pass unnoticed in a culture addicted to surface. To live symbolically is to live dangerously. It is to reject the comfort of literalism and accept the ambiguity of depth. It means allowing dreams to interrupt plans, intuition to question logic, and archetype to reshape identity. It means acknowledging that much of what we call reality is myth wearing modern clothes. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Consciousness changes everything. That is, its power and its price. This is why so few choose it, because consciousness makes you responsible, not just for your actions, but for your inner world, for the shadow you cast, for the lies you tell yourself, for the pain you project onto others. Von Franz understood that once you begin this work, you lose the right to innocence. You cannot claim ignorance when you have seen the pattern. You cannot retreat to the safety of once you've glimpsed the soul behind the mask. But there is also a strange liberation in this. Because symbolic awareness is not just a burden, it is a doorway. It allows you to live in relationship with the world, not as a fixed thing, but as a living dialogue. It restores meaning where nihilism has taken hold. It lets you suffer consciously, which is the only way suffering becomes transformation. Von Franz did not offer easy hope, she offered clarity, and she insisted that to become conscious was not only an individual achievement, but a moral stance. In a world seduced by distraction, to pay attention is an act of courage. In a world addicted to simplicity, to think symbolically is an act of love. Consciousness will cost you your illusions, but it will give you your soul.